The guest that we have coming up here, Lindsay, in just a little bit. In just a little bit. When I read the article, I kept thinking about you because I kept thinking about the idea. I love that Scott Shea does this. He tracks people. He doesn't just tell you what happened, but like with Van Morrison, with the Mamas and the Papas, and everybody else, he writes about Wolfman Jack. I love that he actually just tells you how people got where they got, because that, I think, is the most important thing about music historians, when they can actually trace the person from their beginning point and show you how both their talent and their failings put them where they ended up being, and it becomes a great value lesson. I know why I like a good origin story, and you and I love that SNL movie about the first night of SNL. You and I love the idea. And one of the most exciting things about this show, about being here for it now, and the people that are commenting over on YouTube and Facebook. Jody gave us 200-something-somethings, and the Ritters are listening. All these people are listening. It really feels like we're at the beginning of something, doesn't it? It's the first time I've had that feeling in a long time, that we're at an origin point. And I love that feeling. And I was kind of curious if that's what you dug about origin stories.
Yeah, I think what Scott Shea, who's a brilliant author and writer, who's joining us here in just a minute or two, what he does so well that you alluded to is, yes, the origin story, but also the idea of legacy and wherever that legacy comes from. I'm excited to dive into some of the pivot moments in a lot of people's pivot. And a lot of people's stories, that moment that changed everything. I heard him talking on Instagram about the Waylon Jennings moment, which I want to talk about, where he gave his plane seat away to the Big Bopper, and we know how that story finishes. And so, talk about a pivot moment for both the Big Bopper and Waylon, of course. But that's the kind of thing. Yeah, I feel that here. We're building something, and it's not hard and it's not easy, but it's also led with the right intention and coming from a place of real inspiration. And I think that's what Scott does really well. Because I want to talk to him about how he puts his stamp on someone else's story. That's kind of strange to be a writer. Like, I'm telling someone else's story. So how do I tell it in my voice without just giving the facts? You know what I mean? So that's really interesting. But he does that really well from a legacy standpoint. And that's what I've been really interested in. That's why I loved the BET Awards the other night and that Icon Award, and hearing people talk about, and hearing Snoop Dogg talk about, legacy is what, the idea of what you leave behind. And it's not even fame, because so many of Scott's stories here are the people behind the scenes, which if you're equating that to what we're building here, Jim, you know how many people we have behind the scenes here that are way more important than you and I, because without them, people can't hear you and I. So it's such a team effort and all of that. So it'll be a fun conversation.
And with that in mind, Dre, keep it down. God almighty.
Seriously, it's so hard to find good help around here. Thought it was so funny. Should we talk to Scott?
Yeah, let me set this up, by the way. He is a remarkable music historian, and by the way, slowly expanding that reach to talk about more and more great origin stories and points. You remember him first from All the Leaves Are Brown, how the Mamas and Papas came together and broke apart. He spent time with Dave talking about Wolfman Jack. He spent time with us talking about Brown Eyed Girl. Do you remember when we used to sing? Van Morrison would have liked to have forgotten it. But we are joined by Scott Shea this morning. How are you, sir? Welcome back as always.
Scott Shea! Hey, guys. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed sitting here listening to you compliment me.
we can put you back on mute and talk about you more if you want.
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Yeah,
we're really good at ignoring the guest, and we're good at that. Well, Scott, welcome to the show. I have to mention, just since Jim alluded to your the Van Morrison Brown Eyed Girl, I have to say I sang down on Broadway here in Nashville at Tootsie's for years, and my husband hates the song Brown Eyed Girl so much. There's something in it that just irks him to his core but people of course request it when in their drunken stupor. So I had to sing it so many times, but he would I would see him, someone request, it's that song in Margaritaville for him. I will see him get up and leave a show and go to another bar.
I'll walk with him on Margaritaville. I'll walk with him. You know why I'll leave. Oh my God, good for him.
But with that, actually, it poses a question to you, Scott. What are some of the best known songs, some of the most irritating songs? I understand earworms and such, but how does something like Brown Eyed Girl that you either love it or you hate it, or you hate to love it, or you love to hate it. But why are some of those songs, such epic songs, so freaking annoying? What's your take?
It's a good question. I guess probably repetition would be one thing. I mean, those are songs you hear them on classic rock stations, you hear them on oldie stations, and you hear them on light FM stations. So they're like everywhere, and they get into that rotation. And I think for people who like us, who are music lovers, and when you see people who aren't, get excited about it, maybe it's something annoying to you. People, it's like, why? I don't want to see other people enjoy this song. I know better. This song isn't as good as everybody thinks it is. So maybe there's a little bit of that going on. We're all a little bit of guilt. Anybody who's a music lover is a little bit guilty of that. And you can count me among them. I listen. Those are two great songs. But if I never hear them again, that's fine, because I've heard them enough. And I'll throw Aretha Franklin's "Respect" in there, and "Hey Jude" by the Beatles, and a few others that they're good songs. They are deep into the fabric of music culture and pop culture, and are going to be around forever. But man, they get played a lot, So it's like
too much.
I'm kind of done with them.
Well,
wait, is that the? Sorry, Jim, real quick, but is that the? Jim and I talk a lot. We have a real thing about Morgan Wallen here. We make fun of him, and we think there's an evil genius behind it, whether it's the machine or Morgan himself. But are there evil geniuses behind? Was there an evil genius behind Brown Eyed Girl that was like, or was something like that more of just a lucky spin, or was it okay? We're going to make sure something happens.
You ain't seen nothing yet.
Talk about it.
Yeah.
There's definitely an evil genius. It was Burt Burns. He was the producer. He was mobbed up. He was, he had a rough temperament, but he was also a brilliant songwriter, and he knew a hit when he smelled one. So, he picked that song out of a lineup from Van's songs, and he went with it and ran with it. And I think Van also going out on his own and having a formidable career, becoming a legend, also helped that song grow, because it is a catchy song. It was a big hit. It was his first hit, and it traveled with him, whether he liked it or not.
Yeah, and that's kind of the same thing with Margaritaville. But you ain't seen nothing yet, baby, because that's what we're talking about today. A little bit of Bachman-Turner Overdrive, a little bit of the Guess Who, but behind it all. And this is, like I said, when I read this article, and I thought about you, Lindsay, too, because man, Chad Allan's story is exactly the kind of story that you gravitate to and say, how could you give up the keys to the kingdom? Because this is a reluctant rock star, or could have been, should have been, would have been, except at the end of the day, he could never get his feet in one part of the world or another. He was always being pulled back and forth. Set up for us who Chad Allan is.
Yeah, and not only did he give the keys to the kingdom up once, he gave it up twice. He was a Canadian kid in the late 50s who started a group called Allan and the Silvertones, who became Chad Allan and the Reflections, who became Chad Allan and the Expressions, and then became the Guess Who. So he is essentially the founder of the Guess Who, and they had a big hit under the name Guess Who and Chad Allan and the Expressions at the same time, called "Shakin' All Over." It was a big rock anthem in the mid-'60s, kind of right up there with Louie Louie and Gloria and Hang On Sloopy. It was that kind of frat anthem, for lack of a better term. And, it brought them great success, but it also came with some struggles because they couldn't really follow it up. And they brought in a talented keyboardist named Burton Cummings. He was about 17 years old, and within a year or less, Chad Allan was gone. There's never been, the elephant in the room is always Burton Cummings, but there's always been other reasons given for his leaving. He wasn't feeling well. He wanted to go back to college. He hurt his throat singing, not from his diaphragm, But for me, I think it had to be Burton Cummings because, fast forward a few years later, when Randy Bachman is out of the Guess Who, they reunite and form a group called Brave Belt, who they morph into Bachman-Turner Overdrive after they bring in Fred Turner, another strong personality, another strong vocalist, and Chad just kind of, with less than a year after they formed the band and, midway through their second album sessions, leaves again, and then they struggle a little bit, and then within a year they find their mojo and become Bachman-Turner Overdrive.
I'm so Chad Allan, he steps aside each time his bands are about to really hit. So,
Yeah.
In Nashville, of course, we talk a lot about song doctors or whatever you want to call them, folks who, shape careers but stay behind the scenes. This is different because he wasn't necessarily behind the scenes. He's in the band. He just leaves. Call it, I don't know, is that guts or maybe survival instinct? I don't know which it is, but I'm curious if there's a chance. Okay, here, stay with me. Is there a chance
Okay.
Chad was even real? Was Chad is Chad a figment of our imagination because he's like this rock and roll angel who floats in? He kind of helps shapes groups,
Right.
and then he flies onto the next. So how much of history is his? There's so much history where it's really rooted in these invisible hands. But is Chad really real? What was he doing? Why? What's the? I don't know if you did a psychological profile of him or not, but perhaps you should have.
Well, I have seen pictures of him, so I think
good.
he's real.
Okay, good.
But no, that's a good question. And yeah, he's like a rock and roll guardian angel, Or
Yeah.
And I did, I didn't do too much of a personality dive because I'm not an expert at that. But I did say he seemed to be about lifting others up. Like when for instance when Randy Bachman left the Guess Who, he didn't really leave willingly. He had gotten into he had a different lifestyle than his bandmates. They were young guys. They were single. They were into the party scene and the groupies and the drinking and the drugs and
The good stuff.
He had converted to Mormonism, was married, and stayed sober in mind and body, and it caused caused a lot of tension within the group, and eventually, he wanted to kind of pull back and be Brian Wilson, and just kind of maybe not travel with them as much and just kind of stay home and write the songs, and they were having none of that. So it eventually forced his departure, and when he went back to Winnipeg, he couldn't find a soul to play for him. He kind of been blacklisted. And the one guy he ran into at the CBC was Chad Allan, who was who had done some television work. And they decided to record some songs together. So, here he is again. This time, he brings Randy in for the second time because he recruited him to be part of the Guess Who, 10 years earlier. So, at least in the case of Randy Bachman, he was his guardian angel for sure.
Okay.
Really quickly, Lindsay, just wanted to tell you on our new platform, Beach Bum, who's just joining us for the first time, says hello to you, and of course hello to Scott Shea, joining us here on the platform for the first time. You brought the name up, you opened the door, and you actually do it in the article as well, too. I wanted to take a moment here, just as kind of a side mission. You join us less than a week after Brian Wilson has passed away, and given your love of all things rock and roll and the history of rock and roll and origin stories and tracing people, can you kind of talk really briefly before getting back to Chad Allan? Always taking second fiddle to somebody else. Poor Chad.
Oh, Chad.
Can you talk for a minute about Wilson's contribution and why he's so important to American rock?
Yeah, I mean, he's kind of like the Gershwin of rock and roll. He created his own musical genre, basically American summer music. And whenever we go to the beach or whenever, there's a movie or a television show that does a beach scene, there's always a Beach Boys sounding song, or if not a Beach Boys song in there. It's the sound of summer, and it's uniquely his own. It's, the chord progressions he used, the instrumentation, it was a mixture of his own style and Phil Spector's wall of sound and, pre-psychedelia pop art that just manifested into the Brian Wilson sound. And there aren't too many people out there. You could probably put Elvis in that category. And you could probably put Johnny Mercer and, like I said, Gershwin and people like that. He for sure was a musical genius. And, I don't throw that term around lightly because a lot of people use that for just about anybody. But he certainly was, because he had an ear for great sounds and, forever we're going to think of Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys when it comes to summer.
I'm just going to really quickly tell Lindsay, if you ever get a chance, you can listen to what he had intended. The opening of Smile gives you a sense of what could have been had things not go so badly awry. The opening of Smile, those harmonies at the beginning, it's a different way of looking at psychedelic culture, a very inherently American way that is just kind of beautiful.
Had that album been released, in its time, we would be talking about that as well, as the incredible follow-up to Pet Sounds.
Yeah, just unbelievable. Okay, I'm sorry, Lindsay. You had a question.
No, you're fine. No, we're going to talk more about in country and Western music news coming up at 10:30. I'm actually going to talk more about Brian Wilson and this album called "Cows in the Pasture." That's kind of he will dive into it. What's going to be released post his passing, but we'll dive into that more. But you mentioned, just to stay on that tip a little bit, and it can parlay into back to Chad Allan, but the idea of, was talking about Brian Wilson creating a genre. And I think, I don't know, I'm curious your take, Scott, but I think today, especially today's artists, we've gotten so consumed with what genre is it? What kind of music do you sing? What do you perform? And less about what did you just get in the studio and create today? And I don't know if you think even back in if I just think about it off the top of my head right now, back in the 60s or 70s or whenever, I don't know if we were really talking and I don't know, I wasn't alive, but were we talking so much about genre, and maybe the psychedelics helped because we didn't know what room we were in or what genre we were, but it didn't seem so much about genre then. It seemed more about the creative piece, whereas now it's gotten so we got to put everyone in a box. Did you feel that, as especially leaning back on a lot of people, perhaps with the Guess Who and some of these other bands, where they were just making music as opposed to being like, let's write a country record or whatever?
Yeah, I think that's probably the era when it started. It was in the 60s, especially when folk rock started. That was just a brand given, bestowed on rock music made by former folk musicians, and then we had the British invasion. So, there's good. It's nice to classify certain things, I guess, to suit our tastes, to suit our playlists. But we definitely get bogged down by that, and it's kind of become ridiculous. But that's just the human experience. We always seem to micromanage things like that, and boil everything down to a label. So, but even the Guess Who really kind of transcended that a little bit in the 60s, because they not only were they getting played on AM top 40 stations, but they were also getting played on FM progressive stations. They kind of fit both molds, if you will, and which was pretty remarkable, because there weren't too many that did that. I mean, the Beatles, Bob Dylan, a few others, and the Guess Who were just kind of were one of the few groups who just kind of came out of nowhere at that time, and kind of pleased both crowds.
I wanted to ask you this question because you got a chance to immerse yourself both in the Guess Who and in Bachman-Turner Overdrive. And, the connective tissue is Bachman, and of course it's also Chad Allan. Is there a distinctive sound, a kind of thing, a signatory sound that either one of those men, where you actually begin to hear, wait a minute, this is actually the product of the same creatives? Because often you'll get people where even if they try to do something different stylistically, we can't escape their voice, we can't escape their licks. There's something about it where you can hear their signature in the music. Did you have that experience?
Well, I think when Randy formed Brave Belt, he definitely went out of his way to not sound like the Guess Who. So he went like pure country rock, which was the sound that was kind of big at the time. The Flying Burrito Brothers and even the Byrds, and so many Graham Parsons and so many others from that time. And a lot of people were getting caught up in that. But by the time he got to Bachman-Turner Overdrive, he just kind of went pure hard rock, and it really seemed like the Guess Who 2.0, if you will. But there's definitely some similarities, but there are differences, and obviously Burton Cummings and Fred Turner were two just extraordinarily powerful vocalists, but they were both very different. But I think had Burton Cummings been the singer of Bachman-Turner Overdrive, it probably would have sounded a lot like the Guess Who. But It's interesting because as BTO was rising, the Guess Who were falling, and he even outshined his own band there in the glory days of BTO. So, it does have. I don't possess the keenest ear for guitar sounds and bass and rhythm sections and stuff like that when it comes to bands. But I would imagine people who excel at that would probably tell you there's a lot of similarities between the rhythm sections and the guitar sounds of BTO and the Guess Who.
There's a certain thrum. There's a certain thrum that they both have. A kind of a really
thrum.
Yeah, I mean, it's really
That's a word.
It really is kind of, and everybody who knows what I'm talking about, which includes, of course, Lindsay Lawler and Scott Shea.
Of course.
By the way, the article is called "How Chad Allan Quietly Sparked a Canadian Rock Revolution." It can be found at Strange Brew, where Scott is a regular contributor. Has written some terrific pieces for those guys over there.
Yeah, there's a lot of cool. If you go to thestrangebrew.co.uk, there's a search bar on there. Just put in Scott Shea's name, and you can see all the articles. He's written a great overview of what he has. Scott, I mean, we haven't even, I don't know, Jim, and if I'm going to put Scott on the spot and everybody on the spot here, we have to take a quick break here in about a minute. Would you come back for maybe 5 minutes with us, Scott, after this? I mean, the break is super short because I want to talk to you about Waylon and Willie in Nashville, if you'd be okay with that. Jim, is that cool?
Oh my God, that's groovy fun. We're going to have a new segment called Scott on the Spot. That's what we're going to do it.
I like that. And it's also, hey, Scott, can you stay? If you say no, everyone's listening and they'll think you're a jerk. Just kidding.
Don't be a jerk.
Yeah, I can stay for sure.
Let me take care of some business here. Go to radionemo.com, hit that 365 play button, go to the tube of you, hit subscribe, go to iHeartRadio, you can listen to us at Radio Nemo, and of course, big welcome to our friends from OIDA. Guys, by the way, check out shadyrays.com. They got your back with lost and broken protection programs. Dre, hit that music. Let's take a break, come back, and keep Scott on the spot. Thank you, Lou.
Are you on the hunt for the perfect place to recharge after a long day or week on the road? Look no further. Hotels for Truckers, designed by truckers for truckers, provides free membership that unlocks access to deep discounts and spacious tractor-trailer parking at thousands of popular hotel chains nationwide. Enjoy incredible discounts, earn valuable points, and enjoy a great night's rest. Download the Hotels for Truckers app today and make your long hauls more restful and affordable.
Your Weekend 34 is interviewing two batteries for truckers who are weekend warriors. Odyssey Battery and Some Other Battery. You all right there? Some Other Battery?
I've been in storage for months. I'm kind of run down. Could we do this later?
Weekend will be over later.
Tell us about it, Odyssey.
I've been in the garage just as long, all winter. I'm ready to start. Ready to start anything. Motorcycles, ATVs, personal watercrafts, boats, even RVs.
Impressive.
You're charged because I'm charged.
Any advice to finish?
I'm finished.
Finished? Told you. I'm just getting started. Strong starting power and long shelf life. Check me out at odysseybattery.com.
Odyssey Battery. Your weekend is just getting started.
You know Sap Brothers will beat any competitor's advertised price on tires, so hold on to that fifth wheel, because when you buy 4 Salem S624 EFTs, the perfect line haul trailer tire, mounted at Sap Brothers, your price is an amazing $199.99, originally priced at $299.99, and prices are good through June 30, 2025, while supplies last. Save on 4 or more at Sap Brothers, and nobody's going to beat that price. Salem Tires, advanced compound technology for maximum mileage and rolling resistance without compromise. When you think tires, think Sap Brothers.
Did you know it's extremely easy to join the Wreaths Across America mission to remember our fallen heroes, while at the same time honoring those who are currently serving our country and their families? Plus, you're helping to teach our younger generation about the value of freedom. With just one $17 donation to Wreaths Across America, you're sponsoring a fresh Maine Balsam Remembrance Wreath. They've really become a symbol of America's respect for those who bravely served and are no longer with us. To sponsor your wreath, just visit wreathsacrossamerica.org. That's wreathsacrossamerica.org.
Well, that music means that we're back live from the Crescent City at the Fastport Studios with Jimmy Mack and Lindsay Lawler.
Hey guys, go to #RGR. Make sure you do that. Welcome back. And by the way, head over to truckdown.com. If you, in fact, break down, they can hook you up with a maintenance provider. They do all 50 states, 8 of the provinces. Well, go to truck down, truck up, and get down. Welcome back, Lindsay Lou, no more than 2, child at heart.
Is that a fat joke?
It is. Continue.
Whatever.
Go
Whatever.
on.
Welcome back. We're talking with one of our Scott on the spot, as we call it, Scott Shea, who's a brilliant music historian and a great writer. And we've had him on to talk about All the Leaves Are Brown, about the Mamas and the Papas in the past, and then all his mini articles. But so, Scott, welcome back. Not that you had a choice, but thank you.
Thank you.
No, we're glad to have you. And I was listening on your Instagram about the Waylon moment, and I knew some of that story with Buddy Holly and the Big Papa, and the flight that goes down, but I didn't realize the full backstory about how Waylon gave up his spot to the Big Papa, to the Big Bopper. I'm sorry, and someone else gave up their spot on that plane. Who was that? I forget now.
Tommy Alsop, he was also playing with Buddy Holly. He was the guitarist and the band leader, and he gave it up to Richie Valens.
Yes, right. So that, obviously that's a horrible tragedy and loss. However, two things can be true at once. As horrible as a tragedy that was, and we lost so many music icons, it also set the stage for other music icons, which is a crazy sliding doors moment and shift. Yeah. And that's Waylon giving up his seat, not dying that day, is a whole big catalyst for outlaw country, and Waylon being one of the biggest men who shaped outlaw country. So I guess I want to talk about that a little bit, but these moments in history that I'm sure you've written about so much, are there any other pivot moments like that come to mind where it was like, this happened and therefore everything changed? That's got to be an ongoing theme, I would think, in music.
Oh yeah, gosh, off the top of my head, I can't think of any, but I know there have been many. You can even look at Buddy Holly. Buddy Holly was signed to Decca Records in 1956 and went to Nashville to record, and had a horrible experience, and it led to him going to New Mexico to record with Norman Petty. So, those things happen. And then, Waylon comes into his life, and then, fast forward, 7-8 years later, and Waylon goes to Nashville and experiences the same things that Buddy Holly had told him about, so yeah. It's interesting just the way things fall like that. Or, Willie Nelson, stay with the outlaw theme, being a DJ in the state of Washington, Vancouver, and running into Mae Boren Axton in the studio and playing his songs for her. She was the mother of Hoyt Axton and the co-writer of Heartbreak Hotel. And, she really encouraged him to, you need to get out of here and go to where the music is, because these songs are too good, and don't sell them, So there's so many. I think every great group has that story. And, the Beatles playing in Hamburg, and the Rolling Stones, and Mick Jagger and Keith Richards meeting each other on a train after they hadn't seen each other. They were schoolmates. And it was a bus or a train in London, and I think Keith had been carrying a stack of blues records, and it just sparked the conversation. So, there's just so many great stories out there of just being in the right place at the right time. And I think that, I think we know with everybody who's been successful, there's luck plays a big part, and that goes from, corporate CEOs to music stars to radio hosts. Yeah. Everybody has a little bit of luck that helps them out. The national championship winners, there's Super Bowl winners. There's always a game that they won that they should have lost.
Yeah.
So, there's always something that helps people along the way.
And call it luck, call it fate, or the intention behind it. But I just want to say real quick, Jim, too, Scott, the idea that not only did because you talk about how Waylon's that led to Waylon giving up his spot and then to Big Bopper, and the Big Bopper dying because of it. It led Waylon down a path of real depression, which, I mean, you could say his depression is what, led him to maybe drugs and alcohol, which therefore led, or more of it, whatever, I don't know, but which then helped shape outlaw country, which is maybe a positive thing for all of us, but maybe not him. I don't know. It's such a crazy way to, I guess it's all perspective though, right? But it's A led to B, led to his depression shaped outlaw country, really, right?
Yeah, well, he got into he became a pill popping maniac in the 60s, much like Johnny Cash was, and those two actually became roommates for a little while. And it did. He got into a real, he started off strong when he got to Nashville, but got into a real rut there in the late 60s. And, it's funny because I'm writing a biography on him right now that kind of focuses on that time period of his life. And, a lot of people think that Waylon was always Waylon and he just came in and people didn't know how to record him and the Nashville system took over. But, there's two sides, like you say, there's two sides to every story. And, the people, the Nashville studio musicians who tried to shape his sound, and, we're talking people like Jerry Reed and Pig Robbins and Fred Carter Jr. and Chet Atkins. I mean, we're talking some brilliant musicians, so it's not like they just just tried to hijack his career and shape him in their sound. They tried to help him and the sound didn't work, but he learned from it. And, he was able to eventually produce himself and make all those great records that he's known for.
It's interesting because the questions that Lindsay's asked you and the answers you've given in many ways have, to some degree, answered my question that I was going to ask you, which is, there is a theme that is running through your work. You really like tracking people through their origin points and kind of showing us how they got there. You often don't editorialize in your writing. Rather than kind of, giving a grand summary, you simply present the facts as they kind of unfold. And the idea that, these people are lucky, but, there's also the ability to put yourself in a position to be lucky, even if it is simply not being ashamed to carry a giant stack of blues records on your lap while on a train. And there are people who would hide that stuff, who would be like, I don't want people to see what I'm doing here.
Right.
And so I was kind of curious, have you kind of examined your own love of origin points, of how like a particular song gets written? Because the one thing I notice in your writing is you're pretty darn great at not only kind of keeping the character straight, but keeping the time frame and the locations at which things happen so that we can follow the map that you spread out. Is that a deliberate strategy of yours, or has it become reflexive?
Yeah, I do try to write it in real time. Like, I want to put you in if I'm writing about 1967, I want you to be in 1967. I don't want to really refer to what came after that. Maybe sometimes for reference, if it calls for it. But I want to take, for like the Mamas and the Papas story, I really didn't reference much of what came after because, I think that takes away from the story. It's kind of like a little bit of a crystal ball, and I want to try to put you in the moment and see what these people were dealing with and things like that. And you don't really have to be an expert to do that because so many of the things that these people have experienced, we've experienced in some way or another. We've had loved ones pass away. We've had parents get divorced. We've seen friends and loved ones deal with addiction and things like that. So, we've all had the same human experience as these people. So, I do try to put that into my music, or my writing, I should say. And, my love for origins, really, it goes back. It's always been with music. I've always been fascinated where things came from. I remember my dad had a bunch of Willie Nelson records when I was a kid, and they, when I was a kid in the 80s, Willie had a big beard and he had pigtails and, he dressed, like he was going to a flea market, and he had these records of Willie in like a suit and these slick back hair and clean shaven, and I was just fascinated with that, and I loved the music. It's like, this is there's versions of Funny How Time Slips Away and Crazy and Hello Walls and stuff like that, and it just it just really got to me. And that's kind of how I got into Waylon, because I was into Buddy Holly, and I bought this big box set. And, here's this song by Waylon Jennings from 1959 that Buddy had produced. It was his first single, Jolie Blonde. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, wait a minute, 1959 is a long way from the mid-'70s when Waylon got big. What happened between then? So that's when I started investigating and collecting and, taking in the music.
And I want to kind of show everybody out there who's listening how terrific this is. When you do actually put little drops in to kind of explain the world around there, there's a mention of the world going from black and white and to color from 66 to 1967. And I don't know why, Scott, but immediately I thought about the cover of Revolver, and then I thought about the cover of Sgt. Pepper's.
Yeah.
And the idea that the black and white of Revolver, as complicated and as beautiful as it is, can't contain the record anymore, and that the whole world shifts into color. And to simply drop that line in there is a great way of telling the audience, the reader, this is the engine turning over moment. This is what kind of color is what welcomes in the 60s, right?
Yeah, and I also think of like TV. I think of the Andy Griffith Show. All the great episodes are in black and white, and then all the not so great episodes are in color. But it's like it's like when it switched. When that's when most people had color TV by then. So it's that same period, the mid '66 into '67, and Revolver and Sgt. Pepper. That's always what's in my mind too. The big bright Technicolor of Sgt. Pepper and the black and white of Revolver. It's like the line of demarcation between the British Invasion Beatles and the classic rock Beatles,
We're talking with Scott Shea. You can see more if you head on over to thestrangebrew.co.uk and put his name in. You can, of course, also find everything out about Scott if you go to Scott Shea, that's SHEA, ScottSheaAuthor.com. Scott, I want to leave you with this legacy question because I've been reading. I loved how Snoop talked about legacy on the BET Awards last week. Speaking of legends and icons, but my question to you, because you've studied all the past, looking forward to the future, or sitting here in the current, what would you say today's art? And this sounds like a slam, and I don't mean it in that way, and maybe there won't be anything. But what do you think today's artists are missing when it comes to legacy building? Because I wonder how sometimes the legends of back in the day, so to speak, did it better, whether in craft or character. Were their lives harder? Were they not as coddled? Were they not as seen as much due to social media? I think it's a combination of those things, but we're building different kinds of legacies these days. So what's the difference in a legend from the past versus Morgan Wallen, who's trying to create himself as a legend today?
I think there was a greater sense of community back in those days. There were three or four channels, on television. There were where depending on where you lived, there were probably two big stations that you could get on the radio, and you had to be really, really good to get onto those because the competition was stiff and there weren't as many platforms. So I think that it made the movers and shakers and the gatekeepers a little bit more discerning. Whereas now it's like you can just kind of make a record and throw it on YouTube, and it's probably going to stink, but there are those exceptions, and but I always say there's great music to be found everywhere, any era. There's even good country music from the 90s, so
it's my favorite.
You can, prime country right there.
Yes,
but you can find great music everywhere. There's great country music. Like I love Midland. I love Zach Top. I love people like that. That just still kind of embody the traditional sound. And there's just there's great music everywhere. There's great soul music being made. There's great rock music being made. You just have to look for it a little bit harder, but you'll find it if you really try.
That's the problem, by the way. When you get so much great stuff going on, it tends to drown each other out. You just got to look a little bit harder. You can actually figure a lot of it out, by the way, as Lindsay said so nicely, if you head over to scottsheaauthor.com. You can also find him at thestrangebrew.co.uk. Scott, as always, and by the way, he's on the Instagrams and the X formerly, now known as, ex-formerly known as Twitter, at
Now
Scott.
known as Prince.
Yeah, now known as Prince, at Scott Shea Author. Scott, thanks for making the time as you always do, and thanks for going into Bachman-Turner Overtime. Appreciate you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Scott. We should have him back when the Wayland bio comes out. That would be fun.
We should just have him back. We should have him back, period.
We should just have him back.
Got on the spot.
We should have him back. He's got our back.